Yes, the Vikings have definitely caught the imaginations of people around the world, but for me as an Icelander, I think there are quite a few expectations, presumptions and myths floating around, specifically with people coming to Iceland and expecting to see Viking this and Viking that, and thinking that the Viking is maybe something that it actually isn't. So let's run a little video and try to dispel some of those myths. Okay, let's look at first the culture of the Vikings historically. So what is it? I'm going to look at this from what people generally are referring to when they talk about Vikings and Viking culture. I'm going to talk about the Viking term itself a little bit later, and I think you will find that none of us who belong to or have this cultural heritage do actually refer to ourselves or our ancestors as Vikings. We are Nordic people originating from Scandinavia and spreading out throughout the northern Atlantic. And that's really it. Roughly 1,000 years ago, this culture, this cultural area kind of started exploring and expanded quite a bit, starting there in Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway and Denmark. Sailed quite a bit around the North Atlantic and further. Mixed quite a bit as well with Celtic peoples from the British Isles and the northern coast of Europe, and extended their reach inwards through larger rivers quite far into the Eurasian supercontinent. However, we see ourselves as Nordic people, not Vikings, and this is the core problem. So, and I'm going to focus on this from my perspective, the Icelandic perspective, and really the Icelandic language. So, a Viking in Icelandic, Vikingur, doesn't really describe a people or a culture. It's a role or an activity. So not even a job, but a particular role or an activity that somebody takes on for a short amount of time. Closest analogy in English is just raider, somebody who goes on raids. In Icelandic, Vikingur is derived from, so that's the noun, Vikingur. What it means, Vik means a small cove. So it's somebody who coves, or a cover, most likely believed to mean that the Vikings would sail on their ships, their long ships and knarrs, and they would, well, land their ships in coves and hide away in coves nearby coastal settlements, from where they would then raid them from land. So these were basically people going on raids, usually, well, young people, young men. You can almost look at it as a kind of a gap year activity for young men that would go on these raiding journeys to gain fame and fortune and those kind of things. It was not something done by people in general. The Nordic culture is just a culture of people who did everything else. So they were farmers and fishermen and poets and potters and who knows what else. So they weren't all Vikings. This was something done by a small, tiny subset of the population. That's not to say that these weren't violent times, and that's also not to say that the Vikings were particularly violent. That's probably an interpretation or a portrayal given, coming from their victims in general, that they were especially cruel. But I think history has shown, or historical research has shown, that they were no more cruel than other peoples and warring cultures in that time and day, 1,000 years ago. Another huge misconception, of course, is the Hornet helmets. Nobody wore horned helmets. This comes from some props or artwork closely related to one of Wagner's things, the Niflungen ring, or the ring of the Niflungen. So this did not exist in reality. These kind of Hornet helmets, as you can imagine, these are not very clever in battle. People can easily grab a hold of these and you can get them tangled and stuff. So it looks dramatic, it looks fierce, but nobody wore this in reality. So that's one common Viking myth out there. Another interesting thing, and again this is related, or I find it interesting, it relates to the Icelandic language. I'm mentioning this because it relates a little bit to the Icelandic language. There is this typical portrayal of Vikings as filthy barbarians. They actually weren't filthy. So the Nordic people back in the day, and hopefully still today, I have soap, had a very strong tradition of bathing and washing. And in even much stronger so than other people in Europe. So I think they were generally looked at as being clean, smelling quite nicely, and being looked at favorably from that perspective. And what I wanted to mention from the Icelandic language is that we even have a term for this in our calendar today. Our Saturday, once a week, our weekly bath, is called laugardagur. That's the day when you wash, so it's wash day. Laug can mean pool, but it can also mean to wash. Að lauga, to wash. So laugardagur is wash day, the day of the week where you would take time aside to actually wash yourself properly. Now, also in Iceland, when we say we are descendants, and this is talking about Iceland specifically, not the Nordic culture generally, we traditionally portray ourselves as or think of that we are true extensions of Nordic culture. That's not as true, we realize today, as we thought back in the day. We know now that we are much more of a 50-50 mix between Celtic peoples and Nordic peoples, and there's very strong evidence to suggest that there were actually Celtic settlers here, maybe even before the Nordic people arrived. The Norse explorers arrived in Iceland in the late 9th century, but that in the early centuries of settlement there were quite a few Irish or Celtic settlements here as well, who coexisted peacefully with the more recently immigrated Nordic people. If you're interested in that particular thing and you're visiting in Iceland, you should go to the town of Hella in the south of Iceland. Hella is a word actually derived from caves, and there are some interesting man-made caves there which are traced way back to those times and seem to follow the traditions of man-made caves in the British Isles. So there's strong evidence to suggest this thing exactly. And you can probably see this from my hair. So my hair has these ginger roots, which I think we usually trace back to Celtic origins. Yeah, that's pretty much it. There's another thing which I love, which probably comes from, and I'm just guessing here, but I just really like this idea that there's I like these, it's called etymology, right? The origin of words. I love these things, and I love to see how words in different languages seem to be connected and have an effect on each other. And there are two words in English and in Icelandic which are closely related, but they describe a similar thing, but they have a very different emphasis on them. It's the word in English, ransack, the verb to ransack, and there's an Icelandic verb called rannsaka, which is pretty much exactly the same thing. But the interesting thing, if this actually comes back from Viking raiding days, that it has those connotations of being the one attacking or ransacking and being the one on the receiving end of it. Because I think the English word ransack means to kind of search and kind of investigate thoroughly, really with the intent to steal or capture or take something. So it has a really negative connotation to it. Whereas in Icelandic, rannsaka completely just means research today. It just means to investigate something. So there's no indication of any wrongdoing in it. It's just to investigate. And if you look at something like a research branch of an Icelandic university, that's something which is called rannsóknir, so research. So rannsaka in English on the receiving end of the rannsóknir from the, well, Nordic Vikings in that particular case. Anyway, that was it. Just wanted to, well, have a little bit of fun with it. Keep in mind, like always, I'm just a layman, so I'm neither a historian nor an anthropologist. I'm just a local Icelander with an interest in these things. If you have any questions on the topic, something you want to correct or get more information on, drop them in the comments below. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.